My wife asked if she could go to dinner alone with her boss, but my cruel response left her frozen, because she hadn't expected to hear, "If you go, don't come back." I said it calmly, but with everything already decided within me. She hesitated, but went. She closed the door softly, as if still waiting for me to call her back, but I just got up and started removing our photos from the walls. There was no shouting, no crying. Only a bitter, dry silence, like the sound of something dying inside. I knew that invitation wasn't just work, I knew it deep down, in that way only those who truly love can recognize the scent of a lie before it's even spoken. And yet, I allowed it. Not out of weakness, but out of conviction. If she wanted to go, then so be it. But don't expect to find the same man when you return. Because I wouldn't be there anymore. At first, it all seemed like a tease. An innocent dinner, a harmless curiosity. She came back late, saying it was just work, that there were other colleagues around, that it was quick. But her eyes, her gestures, the way she avoided my touch, the silence disguised as fatigue, everything screamed for help or guilt. And I, even knowing this, pretended for a while. Not out of fear of losing her, but out of disgust at dragging myself along for someone who no longer chose me. I saw everything, every detail, every slip, every quickly deleted message, every smile she gave on her phone. And when she asked if she could have dinner with him again, alone, I realized there was no longer any doubt. This had been happening for some time. I just wasn't part of her story anymore. The most unbearable thing was the way she seemed to want me to agree. As if my permission would wash away the mess of the act. As if, by asking me, she could share with me the responsibility for a decision she'd already made. She said, "It's just a conversation to align with him, about an important project. It's just dinner, nothing major." I took a deep breath, looked her in the eye, and replied with the calm of someone who's bled everything they can, "If you go, don't come back." She was silent for a few seconds, unsure if I was bluffing. But I wasn't bluffing anymore. I wasn't trying anymore. I wasn't begging. She smiled awkwardly, looked away, and left. And in that instant, even before the door closed, I knew that chapter of my life was over. Not with an explosion. But with the cruelest of deaths, indifference. The time that followed was strange. I didn't cry, I didn't scream. I just watched, like someone watching a fire from afar. Memories invaded the house like ghosts, the breakfast she'd made on Saturdays, the perfume she'd left on the pillow, the notes left on the fridge. Little by little, all of this became signs of something that was no longer real. I began emptying drawers, sorting clothes, saving pictures. Not as revenge, but as liberation. I discovered that the worst pain of betrayal isn't the act itself, but the feeling of being left behind. Realizing that while you were thinking about buying wine for dinner, the other person was thinking about what excuse to use. She didn't come back that night. Or the next. And when she did, days later, she wanted to come in as if nothing had changed. "We need to talk," she said, her eyes filled with something that looked like guilt but sounded more like fear of losing comfort. I was sitting on the couch, my bags packed. I looked at her but said nothing. She came closer, touched my face, tried to smile. It was a mistake, I was confused. Nothing happened. Nothing happened. Those words echoed like an insult. As if I were too foolish not to see what had happened between the lines of her gaze. As if I didn't know exactly what goes on between two adults at a dimly lit dinner, full of smiles and subtle compliments. "It's not about what happened," I finally replied. "It's about what you chose to allow. About the space you gave. About the doubt you planted between us." She tried to deny it, tried to justify it, said she was needy, that I was distant, that she needed to feel admired again. And all of that only served to remind me how right I was to let her go. Because true love doesn't demand an audience. It's self-sufficient. And what she wanted wasn't love, it was attention. It was to be desired, without having to offer anything in return. She spent days trying to convince me. She cried, apologized, swore nothing happened beyond words. But betrayal doesn't just lie in touch. It begins in absence. In secrets. In intentions. And the truth is, even before cheating on me with him, she had already betrayed me within herself. Choosing risk, choosing ego, choosing someone who saw her as a distraction, while I saw her as home. Time passed. Her messages became more rare. And I moved on. Slowly, yes. With pain, with heaviness, with sleepless nights. But I moved on. And it was on this lonely path that I found someone. Someone who didn't ask me for explanations, who didn't delve into my past, who didn't want to know how many wounds I carried. She simply offered me presence. Peace. A sincere gaze. And I, after so much emptiness, finally understood that love isn't noise, isn't drama, isn't competition. True love is calm. And because it's calm, it's strong. One day, months later, the other woman appeared again. She looked for me with downcast eyes, her voice trembling. She said she regretted it. That the other man didn't want commitment, that it was all an illusion. That she thought about me every day. And for a moment, I confess, I thought about everything we had. I thought about the promises, the trips, the laughter. But all of that was memory. And memory doesn't sustain love. Memory is just an echo. And I no longer lived in that past. She asked me if there was still a chance. If we could start over. I took a deep breath. I smiled. And I said I forgave her. Not for her sake. But for mine. Because holding a grudge would be holding me back from the same mistake she made, giving way to something that should have already left. She cried. She said I had changed. And it was true. I had changed. Because now I knew what I deserved. And I knew that love that you beg for isn't worth it. That night she went out to dinner was the end for us. But the true end was when I realized that loving someone doesn't mean accepting everything. That forgiveness is important, but it's not always enough to rebuild what was destroyed by a choice. And that sometimes, the price of freedom is temporary loneliness. But it's always worth it. She lost me. And what hurt her wasn't the end. It was realizing that the love she let slip away, blossomed in another heart. A heart that doesn't demand, doesn't question, doesn't betray. And perhaps what hurt her most was realizing, too late, that she was never betrayed, just replaced. Not out of revenge. But out of deservedness. What she didn't expect, however, was to see me again. By chance. Years later. In an unexpected place. That day, she would understand, once and for all, that some doors, once closed, never open again. And that there are glances that were once home, and today are just scenery. But what she saw in that encounter is what changed everything. And that's where the story really begins. Welcome to the channel. Here, we make it clear, we do not support betrayal in any form. The stories told are fictional, but the feelings, consequences and lessons are too real. Our goal is to show how a wrong choice can destroy homes, hearts and futures. Get ready, because what you're about to hear is more than a story, it's a reality check. Good listening. It was a peaceful neighborhood, with quiet streets at dusk, where houses held secrets behind wide windows and tightly drawn curtains. Theirs was one of those homes. A simple but cozy two-story house with neutral-toned walls, travel paintings on the walls, and a constant aroma of coffee in the morning. There lived a couple many considered exemplary, Ethan and Claire. Married for 7 years, together for 10, they had that appearance of stability that inspires discreet glances of admiration and a hint of quiet envy. Ethan was a man of simple habits, disciplined, soft-spoken, who liked to listen more than talk. He worked as a financial analyst at a mid-sized company, with a fixed and predictable routine, the kind of man who knew exactly where his socks were, his favorite mug, and even the due date of each bill. Claire, on the other hand, had a different energy, communicative, engaging, with a sharp intelligence and a natural charm that made her a heard presence in any conversation. Working as a marketing project coordinator, she dealt with people constantly, faced tight deadlines, big ideas, and inflated egos. She stood out, always did, but never let it go to her head, at least in the early years. The two met when they were young, at a college student conference, and it was one of those connections that needs little explanation. There was something between them, something serene. As she spoke enthusiastically about her ideas and dreams, he watched her with a restrained but attentive smile. Claire often said it was his silence that attracted her. A kind of silence that welcomed, that truly listened. They started slowly, going out for coffee, walks, afternoons in bookstores. The construction was gentle, almost shy, but solid. By the time they decided to move in together, there was already a complicity between them that many couples don't achieve even after decades. Ethan admired Claire's strength, her ambition, the way she entered a room and transformed everything around her. Claire, in turn, valued the calm Ethan brought. He was her anchor, her shelter, the perfect counterpoint to her hectic energy. During the first years of their marriage, their routine was almost poetic. They cooked together on Friday nights, shared wine and secrets on Sundays, and had personalized playlists for specific moments of the day. When something got out of control, like Ethan's unexpected layoff or Claire's close relative's illness, they dealt with it together. They cried, they argued, sometimes they fell silent, but they always came back to each other. It was as if they carried within themselves a silent promise, to not give up. To try. To stay. But time doesn't stop, and with its cruel patience, it piles on the tiredness, unnoticed gestures, unspoken words, and unnamed waiting. They both began to change without realizing it. Ethan, caught up in the pressure of his new position, began working longer hours, retreating even deeper into his own silence. Claire, increasingly recognized at work, began to be invited to events, external meetings, and short trips. She liked this. She liked the feeling of being seen, heard, of having her worth recognized in environments that didn't require filters or sacrifices. It wasn't that she had stopped loving Ethan. Quite the opposite. She still saw in him the man she'd chosen to build her life. But she began to miss something. Intensity. Newness. Attention. Conversations, once so frequent and deep, became shallow, practical, almost administrative. Did you pay the rent? Can you pick up the car tomorrow? I spoke to your mom, she's better. Romance, once spontaneous, became schedule-dependent. Dinners for two were interrupted by work messages. Evenings once filled with stories and hugs were now brief and silent, with a quick kiss and a "good night" murmured in the dark. And yet, there was affection. It was there, in small gestures, in the food left in the microwave, in the iron and carefully folded blouse, in the reminder to take her medicine on her phone. But it was an affection that, little by little, began to feel insufficient. As if it were resisting more than flowing. Claire, who had always been so direct, began to keep some of her dissatisfaction to herself. She didn't want to hurt. She didn't want to demand anything. She told herself it was just a phase, that all couples go through it, that true love is proven precisely in the moments when passion subsides. And Ethan, who sensed the growing distance, didn't quite know how to reach her. He was afraid to ask, afraid of being told it wasn't enough anymore. So he preferred to remain silent. He preferred to continue offering everything he could, the way he knew how, with consistency, with presence, with care. But sometimes, love alone isn't enough, especially when you don't know where the soul's leaks lie. Their closest friends noticed the change. Some commented jokingly, others with concern. But the couple remained. At parties, they still smiled for photos. They still hugged in public. They still maintained an image of harmony. And there were good days, yes. Days when they seemed to rediscover the thread that united them. When they laughed together over something trivial, when she rested her head on his shoulder on the couch, when he made her coffee just the way she liked it and she said, "Thank you," with a sincere smile. But those days began to become more spaced out. And what was once the exception now became the rule, absence, even within presence. Over time, Claire became more involved in work projects, especially after a team restructuring that brought her closer to leadership. She was demanded, praised, and listened to. And this revived her. She felt alive there. Important. Desired. Not in the physical sense, but in the emotional sense. She felt needed. And perhaps that was what began to confuse her feelings. The feeling that there, in that environment of goals and meetings, she was seen more than at home. Ethan, for his part, kept trying. Not with grand gestures, he'd never been that kind of man, but with perseverance. He believed everything would fall into place. That the love they'd built was too strong to lose like that. The house, however, began to grow too silent. Dinners became solitary. Mornings were rushed. Birthdays were celebrated with brief outings and hastily chosen gifts. Still, there were no arguments. That was the cruelest detail, their love didn't end in shouts, but in sighs. It didn't break in a single event, but rather in small silences. In unshared decisions. In ignored gestures. Until one day, Claire came home from work with a hesitant tone in her voice. She was more dressed up than usual, wearing a new dress he'd never seen before. She sat at the table, fidgeted with her napkin, and looked at her hands. Then she asked, "Would you mind if I had dinner with my boss today? Just the two of us. It's about a new project, but I need the freedom to talk outside the office." Ethan stared at her for a long time. The silence between them was longer than any argument they'd ever had. She didn't seem nervous. She seemed determined. Like someone who's already made a choice but still forces herself to give the other person a false sense of belonging. He didn't respond immediately. He simply got up, went to the kitchen, and got a glass of water. When he returned, he looked her straight in the eye. And replied, with the same calmness he usually had when resolving anything, "If you go, don't come back." The sentence hung in the air, heavy and definitive. Claire hadn't expected it. Perhaps she thought he would pretend not to care, as he had with so many other absences. But that answer came from a different place. A place where love had already transformed into clarity. She hesitated. She stood there for a few seconds, torn between staying or going. And then, she slowly got up, grabbed her bag, and left. But at that moment, neither she nor he yet knew the true consequences of that step. Because there are choices that seem small, but change everything. There are silences that speak louder than words. And there are doors that, once closed, never open again. Their story didn't end there. But everything that would come after would begin precisely at that moment. And nothing would ever be the same again. Claire didn't return that night. No text. No call. No explanation. Ethan spent the next few hours sitting at the dining table, staring at the still warm plate she'd left. The silence in the house no longer hurt, it was just a reminder of what he already knew. What remained now was confirmation. Not of the betrayal itself, because he'd already silently accepted that, but of the official death of a bond he'd sustained for too long alone. The next morning, she walked through the door unceremoniously, smelling faintly of a different perfume and her hair loose. There was something strange in her eyes, neither guilt nor joy, just emptiness. She tried to act as if nothing had happened, talked about the traffic, mentioned a new campaign at work, and asked if he wanted coffee. Ethan said no. He got up, showered, left for work, and said nothing more. In the following days, the two lived at opposite ends of the house. She spoke little, and he no longer asked questions. Not out of pride, but out of exhaustion. A weary soul has a gentle way of giving up, it doesn't shout, it doesn't demand, it just walks away. She would come home late, say she was exhausted, and avoid any kind of physical proximity. He slept on the couch. Not out of imposition, but because he preferred the sincerity of discomfort to the falseness of sharing the same bed with someone who was no longer there. Until one day, while organizing documents in the living room, he stumbled upon a small blue velvet box on the bookshelf. He recognized it immediately. It was where he kept a family ring that belonged to his mother, something he had given Claire years ago as a symbolic gesture of trust. The box was empty. And that hurt more than he expected. It was as if even the memories had been discarded, as if she had forgotten the weight of everything they represented. It was at that moment that he decided there was nothing left to try. There were no more maybes, no more hope. He began packing his things, calmly, unhurriedly. He separated clothes, documents, books. He took out an old notebook where he'd written sporadic thoughts and left it on the table, with a single page marked with a sentence: "If love has to be asked for, then it's no longer love, it's need." When she arrived that night, she found her bags packed. She asked what was happening, as if everything had happened suddenly. Ethan, his eyes weary, replied simply, "I'm not leaving. I'm just leaving what you left behind long ago." She didn't try to stop him. She stood there, arms crossed, and simply asked where he was going. He replied that he didn't know yet. But he knew what he no longer wanted. And that was enough. The months that followed were of total silence. No contact. No news. She didn't call. Neither did he. Until, about 8 months later, by chance, they met in a bookstore. She was alone, holding a book on self-discovery, her face thinner and her eyes marked by deep dark circles. When she saw him, she hesitated. But then she went to him. Ethan was different. Lighter. His hair was a little longer, he wore a wool sweater, and a smile he hadn't worn in a long time. She commented something about the book she was holding, attempting casual conversation, but he only nodded in response. She asked if he was okay. He said yes. That he was truly okay. And she realized he wasn't pretending. With a shaky voice, Claire finally asked if he was seeing anyone. Ethan smiled, lowered his eyes, and said, "Yes. I met someone who doesn't ask me for explanations, who doesn't test me, who just chooses me. Every day." She tried to smile, but her eyes grew moist. Still, she didn't cry. She asked if he had time for coffee. He hesitated, but accepted. They went to a nearby table. They sat across from each other, with the abyss of almost a year of silence between them. She spoke first. She said that dinner with her boss wasn't just about work. That yes, there had been a closeness, too much conversation, too much praise. That she felt seen, desired. And that, for the first time in a long time, she felt alive. But that it didn't last. She said the man was vain, impulsive, and treated her like a temporary conquest. That it all ended a few weeks later. And that, when she looked to her side, she realized there was no one there. Not her boss, not her husband. Just her and her own choices. "You warned me," she said, her voice breaking. "That night, when you said if I left, I wouldn't come back. But I did. And when I came back, you weren't here anymore." Ethan watched her silently. There was no anger in his gaze. There was understanding. But there was also distance. "I tried to come back," she continued, "but it felt like everything in you had already said goodbye. I screamed inside, but on the outside, I pretended normalcy. I was a coward." He took a deep breath. "You weren't a coward. You were selfish. And maybe it was the first time in my life that I stopped fighting for someone. Because I understood that love is also knowing how to leave when the other person no longer wants us." She lowered her eyes. "Do you love her?" she asked, almost in a whisper. Ethan replied calmly, "Yes. But not like I loved you. With you, I was intensity. With her, I am peace. Claire bit her lip. You were my safe place, she said. And you showed me that no one stays where they're not cared for, he replied. Her eyes finally filled. Not with tears, but with regret. Raw, deep, irreversible regret. The kind that seeks no repair, only understanding. She knew he wouldn't come back. She knew that coffee was just a belated goodbye. And then, as if summoning all the courage she'd lacked in the past, she looked at him firmly and said, "You were the greatest love of my life." Ethan smiled. "And you were the greatest lesson in mine." They got up. He paid the bill. They walked to the corner in silence. She turned left. He turned right. And they never met again. But somewhere inside her, every night, Claire relived that moment. His gaze. The phrase. The silence. And she understood, with the pain of someone who lost what was real, that some loves don't die. They simply cease to be available. Because they were betrayed by absence. And because time, that implacable judge, doesn't forgive those who only realize their value after it's too late. And across town, on a porch with dim lighting and soft music, Ethan held the hand of another woman. Someone who didn't know the details of his past, but who saw in him what Claire forgot, the immensity of a quiet love, one that only wanted to be chosen, and respected. And it was there, on that porch, that Ethan realized that forgiving wasn't forgetting. It was accepting that certain chapters end so we learn not to beg for a place where we're no longer wanted. And that sometimes the best revenge, is simply being happy again. Claire spent the next few months trying to reclaim a life that no longer made sense. She woke up early, kept her work commitments, attended meetings with the same rehearsed enthusiasm, and returned home with the same absence as before, only now with no one waiting on the other side of the door. The apartment seemed larger, colder, quieter than she remembered. She sat on the couch, the TV on just for some nearby sound, but she paid no attention. Time seemed still, as if each day dragged the previous one along with it. She avoided places where she might run into him, but every now and then, along the paths of life, she would cross eyes with people she knew. Every time someone said, "He seems fine," Claire felt a hollowness in her chest, as if she'd lost something she could never get back. And it was true. She had. Not by chance. But by choice. Her attempts to move on were tentative. She dated other men, accepted date invitations, tried to start over somehow, but nothing made sense. His absence was a constant presence in everything she did. Even in the moments when she tried to convince herself she was okay, something inside her pulled her back to the memory of what she had destroyed with a rash decision. It was like a cracked mirror, even when she tried to see herself differently, the fissures were always there, reminding her of what had been broken. She immersed herself in courses, volunteering, and meditation. She sought professional help, tried to reconnect with family members who had grown distant over time, and sought meaning in everything she had previously ignored. But there was a wound that wouldn't heal, the certainty that, out of vanity and neediness, she had lost the only true love she had ever had. Not because she was carried away by passion, but because she confused presence with routine, stability with boredom, security with monotony. And by the time she understood the difference, it was too late. Ethan, on the other hand, approached the new beginning cautiously. During the first few months after the separation, he didn't look for anyone. He rebuilt his routine, reorganized the house, and resumed old hobbies he'd previously neglected. He started hiking on Sundays, photographed ordinary places with a fresh perspective, and found beauty where before he saw only repetition. He didn't close himself off to love, but he didn't chase it either. He let time guide him, and time brought it. He met Julia, a sweet woman who spoke little but with intention, and who carried in her eyes a peace similar to his own. Nothing about her was euphoric. It was all silence, welcome, presence. She didn't constantly ask where he was, nor did she compete for attention. She was simply there. Present. With her, Ethan discovered that love doesn't need grandiose promises. It needs constancy, lightness, respect. She didn't heal him, because he had already healed himself, but she accompanied him. And that was enough. Julia wasn't a replacement. She was a new chapter. And Ethan understood that true love doesn't happen the same way twice. But it can blossom again, if there's truth. They traveled together, laughed at simple things, and fought with maturity. There was no longer any fear of being left, because now he knew how to recognize signs. He knew how to listen to the other person's silence. And above all, he knew how to protect himself. The past remained where it should, in the past. Not with resentment, but with awareness. Claire wasn't an open wound. She was a distant memory, of a life that served to teach that love isn't about self-denial, and that fidelity isn't just physical, it's presence, it's emotional loyalty, it's a daily decision. A year after their last meeting, Claire received an unexpected invitation. It was a mutual friend's wedding. She hesitated, but decided to attend. She wanted to show herself that she had overcome, that she was strong enough to face whatever came her way. She arrived at the venue wearing a modest dress, her hair tied back, and light makeup. She greeted a few people, exchanged smiles, but deep down, her heart was racing. And then she saw him. Ethan, across the room, holding hands with Julia. He was smiling, talking to a couple nearby, unaware he was being watched. Claire stood still. For the first time, she saw the two of them together as one. And she understood. There was no longer room for her in this story. Ethan had found something she couldn't, or wouldn't, give him, peace. Hours later, in the parking lot, they met. It was brief. Ethan stopped politely. Claire, teary-eyed, smiled with effort. She asked how he was. He said he was fine. She hesitated, as if she wanted to say something, but simply touched his arm lightly and wished him well. He thanked her sincerely. And left. Claire stood there, alone, watching the car disappear at the end of the street. And in that moment, she understood that this was the real end. That there was no turning back. That everything she had done, everything she had lost, was by choice. Not by bad luck. Not by fate. But by decision. And that, unlike in the movies, in real life, there aren't always second chances. Claire returned home, opened her laptop, and began to write. She didn't know exactly what. But she needed to get it out. She wrote about love, about absence, about the mistakes we make when we believe there will always be time to fix them. She cried. She laughed at herself. She hated herself for some memories. But late that morning, she felt something new, acceptance. She knew she had lost. That she had destroyed something precious. But she also knew that, even so, she could still build something from the pain. Not a new love, perhaps. But a new consciousness. A new woman. More attentive. More humble. More truthful. A few months later, Ethan and Julia moved to another town. A smaller, quieter place, where they decided to start a life far from the ghosts of their past. They rented a house with a backyard, bought a dog, and planted sunflowers on the porch. They lived a simple life. But there was something rare there, the certainty that they were exactly where they wanted to be. Ethan didn't talk about Claire. Not because he wanted to forget, but because there was nothing left to say. She had been part of his story. An important part. But she was no longer his story. And Claire, now 35, began giving lectures on professional ethics, was promoted, and began to be seen differently. No longer as just a strong woman, but as someone who fell, made mistakes, got up, and learned. She never got involved with anyone at work again. And every time she felt the urge to give in to the impulse, she remembered Ethan's look in that cafe. That was enough to make her back off. This is a story that doesn't end with reconciliation. It doesn't end with a kiss, nor with an airport hug. It ends with lessons. With choices. With the understanding that love is a privilege, not an obligation. And that, by betraying, one betrays not only the other. One betrays oneself. One's very essence. One's own promise. Tell us what you thought of this story in the comments below. Which part resonated with you the most? Do you think Ethan was right not to return? And Claire, did she deserve a second chance? We want to hear your thoughts. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any impactful stories like this. And remember, betrayal destroys. It erodes trust, kills love, drives people apart, and often condemns us to a lifetime of regret. There is no romance in betrayal. There is no glory. Only loss. The channel does not support any type of infidelity. What we share here are reflections to show how one choice can change everything. And sometimes, forever.